In January, Alaska's criminal justice system changed. There are dedicated supporters.
Should people feel safe?
Oh, I think they should feel safer than they did a year ago, for sure.
There are vocal critics.
It is, by all accounts, an experiment. And it is a bad thing to experiment on human lives.
It's a revolving door. It really is. They spit you out to bring it back in, spit you out to bring it back in, and it's like, for what?
Do you think the public thinks they're safer than they are?
Catch and Release, a Voices of Alaska in-depth investigation.
Good evening. I'm Daniela Rivera. What happens in our courtrooms and on our streets changed on January 1st. Alaska is using a brand new pretrial bail system unlike any other. The state now relies heavily, and in some cases completely, on a computer-generated algorithm to make decisions about who stays in jail and who gets released back into the community before trial. Tonight, a little over 3 months in, we're taking an in-depth look at pretrial, where it came from, how it works, and why some say it doesn't. The year was 2014, and Alaska's prison population was growing at a rate the state couldn't afford. The legislature created Alaska's Criminal Justice Commission and tasked its 13 members with finding ways to cut the prison population. By 2016, Governor Bill Walker signed SB 91 into law. The controversial crime package was touted as reform that would save the state hundreds of millions of dollars. SB 91 increased the penalties for the worst offenses, murder 1 and murder 2, but reduced sentences for a majority of the other crime categories, particularly nonviolent crimes.
We are furious.
Public outrage as crime continued to rise led to the passage of SB 54 in 2017.
I'm scared. I'm scared. I've got dogs. I've got guns. I'm still scared.
Undoing some of what lawmakers decided went too far, all before Alaskans had seen the full effect of SB 91.
We've got about 10 officers in this space over here.
Then phase 3, pretrial, untouched by SB 54, began with this new year. Now, every person charged with a crime is evaluated under the state's new risk assessment tool. It works off of a computer-generated algorithm, giving defendants a number between 0 and 10. The score tells judges two things: the likelihood someone will skip future court appearances if they're released before trial, and the risk that they'll commit new crimes during that time. If a defendant is low or moderate risk, depending on the crime, they could qualify for mandatory release.
Meaning the judge would be obligated to release that person without setting a monetary bail. That's what mandatory OR means. They're released on the promise that they will come to court and they will follow the court's rules.
Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way. Jessica Malcolm, a felon, was arrested with a gun in January following a shootout in front of a trampoline park. She scored a 0 on the tool, was released the next day, and then she disappeared. Shane Muse, a suspected 2-time car thief who went on the run when he was supposed to show up in court for a forgery trial, scored a 2 and also qualified for mandatory release. The judge telling the prosecutor she can't legally require Muse to pay bail.
I understand that there's a criteria that's used by pretrial enforcement, but I'm here to tell the court that Mr. Muse presents a risk, a serious risk to the public. That being said, if the court's hands are tied, the court's hands are tied. You have to set bail the way that you're instructed by our new laws.
Muse has several robbery convictions in the state of Hawaii, and Malcolm has a felony history in California. But that doesn't count here because the tool doesn't consider out-of-state history.
We learned during the creation of the tool that out-of-state criminal history was not going to be taken into account.
Deputy Attorney General Robert Henderson says it turns out the FBI wouldn't share its data to set up the project. When asked by lawmakers why the Department of Law and the Department of Corrections moved forward with the tool anyway, Henderson said they had to because of SB 91.
The law was going to go into effect January 1, 2018. So we had to move forward with the tool.
Henderson says 1 in 3 cases that qualify for mandatory release involve out-of-state criminal history.
Mr. Ramos, could you come up to the podium?
David Ramos doesn't have an out-of-state criminal history, but he was out on mandatory release for charges of being a felon with a gun and car theft when APD says he was found in a stolen truck with someone else's bike, another man's gun, one woman's purse, and another woman's groceries, items representing 5 new victims.
And several other states do not include out-of-state criminal history, but no other state has a mandatory release like we have.
Why did we do that?
That is a policy question for the legislature.
Senator John Coghill is chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee and serves on the Criminal Justice Commission. He was instrumental in crafting SB 91 and sponsored the legislation.
We figured that we could mandate those to be released, but they could be released with accountability.
Accountability provided by the brand new Pretrial Enforcement Division, or PED.
What Alaska said is if you go out on bail, we're going to monitor you, which we've never done before.
Jerry Fox, director of PED, says she's hired roughly 40 officers so far.
Go down the sidewalk.
Officers like Katie Perry and Chris Johnson, doing a job that didn't exist prior to SB 91. Part of that includes random compliance checks to make sure defendants are where they're supposed to be and are obeying conditions.
Our job is one part law enforcement, one part parent, and one part social worker. And just like any parent, you want them to succeed. Just like any social worker, you want them to rehabilitate and never come back. And then as a law enforcement officer, you don't want to arrest the same person over and over again.
If people violate, they are going back to jail.
Well, they're arrested.
They are arrested.
They often, what I'm noticing is they're frequently getting right back out.
So those are policy choices that are in our statute.
During the first 2 months of the year, roughly 25% of defendants assigned to PED supervision failed by violating their conditions of release or committing new crimes. And more than half of them were released again by early March.
Defendants get out of jail. They have always gotten out of jail. Defendants get out of jail. In the state of Alaska, there is a constitutional provision that everyone has the right to bail.
Fox says DOC records show that roughly the same amount of people were being re-released before her division started. And that number even goes down from 66% to 61% for people under PED supervision.
I think it's probably the single best public safety element we had in our criminal justice reform system, because it holds people accountable that had never previously been held accountable other than just a dollar amount. And so I think pretrial has been a good thing.
In the House, Minority Leader Sharice Millett isn't as hopeful.
We are putting Alaskans in danger every day when we continue to try and say that that pretrial risk assessment tool is working.
The Anchorage Republican originally carried SB 91's companion bill in the House, but ultimately withdrew her name and voted against it.
When it came to looking for ways to put people in rehabilitation and getting people really the help that they needed, there was no front-end loading on SB 91. It became a lot about saving money and not saving lives.
In the House majority, Representative Andy Josephson says he's also concerned with how Phase 3 of SB 91 is playing out.
I understand the inequality of saying you have $500 and have committed crime X. I don't and have committed crime X, and we have the same criminal history, and I can't get out of jail and you can. That needed fixing. But I think the pendulum got swung way, way too far.
If we don't want to assess risk, then okay, I guess it needs to be undone. If we don't want to have officers out there supervising these folks, then okay, I guess it needs to be undone. But I will tell you this, we're making a safer Alaska by having these two pieces in place. And to argue otherwise is just not being common sense.
It is, by all accounts, an experiment. And it is a bad thing to experiment on human lives.
Both supporters and critics of SB 91 agree Alaska's fiscal crisis and the opioid epidemic are other important factors to consider, along with our laws, when we look at crime in our state. Now we want to welcome our audience watching on Facebook. We'd like to know what you think about the new pretrial bail system.
Share your stories and your thoughts with us, and on Twitter, use the hashtags AKVoices and SB91PED. Up next on Catch and Release.
They might as well be giving you it's a key to the city.
A voice inside the system tells KTVA why it's too easy to beat. There's no shortage of opinions on the new pretrial system in Juneau, but now we bring you a perspective you likely haven't heard until today. This is the voice of a man whose identity we've agreed to protect in exchange for a candid conversation.
Facing more felonies than he can count on one hand, this John Doe is on pretrial release with supervision and an ankle monitor.
Are you addicted to substances?
Yeah.
Which ones?
I don't discriminate. I'm primarily heroin and meth, yeah.
Would you say that's fueled your cases as well?
I can truthfully say it's the sole reason for my cases.
Have you used substances since you were released?
I mean, I'm sure everybody on the ankle monitors use substances. When you have an addiction, it's not something it's not something you can just give up overnight.
What would you want the public to know about being addicted to substances?
It's not always every single person's got a monkey on their back. Just at different points in time in life, we choose a few different things for different reasons. And I made a mistake, and I've been paying for it for a long time.
He says this monitor doesn't help. It tests his sweat for alcohol, which isn't his problem.
I can use heroin or I can use meth.
And with no GPS capability, all he has to do is keep the bracelet near the box, and the box receiving constant power from an outlet or a portable battery pack.
My device plugged in my center console. As far as they know, I'm within X amount of feet of my box, and if the power never goes off on the device, for whatever reason, as far as they know, it's sitting at home on my countertop. And if it's sitting in my car next to me, across town, get away with murder.
He says no one from the state has been to his home to check on him or inspect the device's power source.
They might as well be giving you it's a key to the city.
Do you think the public thinks they're safer than they are?
Oh, most definitely. I know for a fact that they do. I felt a lot safer before I got on it.
And if you're arrested again for violating your conditions of release, what do you think the likelihood is that they'll let you right back out?
My understanding is the likelihood is 100%. With the way that the new bail schedule works, it's a revolving door. It really is. They spit you out to bring you back in, to spit you out to bring you back in, and it's like, for what? Ridiculous. It's a joke. It's a joke.
One with real-life consequences that this John Doe knows are nothing to laugh about.
You probably have some concerns or at least some questions after watching that interview. We did too. So we went to the DOC and a private electronic monitoring expert for answers.
Choose to stay sober and stay clean.
You wouldn't know it talking to him now, but just a couple years ago,
Was working on my 5th felony.
Troy Smith found himself in the same place as our John Doe. His criminal cases also fueled by addiction.
What were you addicted to?
Everything.
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 Now he credits Alaska Pretrial Services, a private electronic monitoring company, for his success.
It's the longest I've been out since I was 14 years old.
He's under court-ordered 24/7 real-time GPS monitoring and an accountability plan the private company made just for him.
I know that I'm being monitored here, And I know that those people aren't being monitored.
Smith says he has acquaintances who are on electronic monitoring under the state's new pretrial enforcement division, with stories similar to John Doe's.
So you know people who are actively cheating these monitors?
Easily.
Jerry Fox, director of the state's pretrial division, says it's using 4 devices for pretrial electronic monitoring, but we've only been able to confirm that one of them has constant real-time GPS capability, like the private company. That puts more than half of the state's pretrial defendants on electronic monitoring on devices that cannot be tracked 24/7. The device John Doe has works on radio frequency, measuring how far away he is from the device's power box.
Is what that person is saying true, that you can just plug it into a battery
I'm not going
pack?
to talk about the technology and what defendants can do to defeat a device or not defeat a device. They don't know how they work.
I'm kind of looking for a confirmation, yes or no, because if it is a yes, that's scary
This
for
is
people.
about, so I run public safety,
Yeah.
and I am not going to tell defendants how those devices work.
So you can't just plug it into a battery pack and drive around Anchorage with it, with the DOC thinking you're at home.
I am not going to tell defendants how an electronic monitoring device works.
This is
Dennis Johnson at the private monitoring company says he is familiar with the state's devices, and he would never put someone in the pretrial phase on a monitor without GPS.
active GPS is the only way to provide for community safety and victim safety and compliance.
And when it comes to GPS monitors,
It's got 11 satellites that's tracking them.
Johnson says not all models are the same.
This is one of the type devices that they use.
But Johnson's company uses this one instead.
The individual took a .40 caliber handgun and shot the device several times. You'll see that the bullet holes in the device, the bullet holes in the back, trying to get the strap off. It was about a 17-minute ordeal, and we were able to get on scene, and we actually took the individual back into custody before he could get the device off his leg. And the device continued to report.
He says getting out of the state's device is just too easy.
Can you take a pair of scissors and cut a strap of what the state's using?
Well, let's see. I would say the answer is yes.
Just like that.
Yeah, just like that. That's unfortunate.
DOC's Fox declined to answer many of our questions about the state's devices, citing public safety. She says they have had some straps cut by defendants, but she says she's seeing success with their alcohol monitoring devices.
People are not drinking alcohol. People who've been severely struggling with alcohol addiction. So there's a story for every case out there, right?
Johnson says he thought the DOC would contract with local companies who've been doing successful electronic monitoring here for years, but says they were never approached specifically about pretrial. While the DOC has told us and lawmakers they did meet with the private companies, supplying us with a log of emails, calls, and in-person meetings.
The way the pretrial private EM individuals were making a living was having people pay for their service to watch them. If you couldn't pay for the service, guess what? You stayed in jail. So for me, as commissioner, that disparity bothered me, and the law made it clear that my job was to get people out regardless if they were a poor person or not.
Johnson says if the state contracted with them, it would remove financial responsibility from defendants. But the DOC went with the out-of-state company BI Incorporated.
The Department of Corrections with this pretrial enforcement division has operated in competition with the private sector. We had 12 companies when this all started. There's now 4 left in the state. And we're not far behind them.
The possibility of this company shutting down too is a reality Troy Smith doesn't want to face.
I love this place, really, I do.
A place he says is doing something right.
After filing a Freedom of Information Act request for DOC's contract with BI Incorporated, we learned the device John Doe has cost the state about $6 per defendant per day, while the GPS monitoring Johnson wanted to offer would have run the state around $15. Fox did tell us the state's devices alert when tampered with, and if a strap is cut, they're notified immediately. When we come back, Voices for Change.
I can no longer stand behind Senate Bill 91.
A look at the pretrial changes proposed in Juneau as time runs out on the legislative session. Both critics and supporters of the new pretrial system and risk tool agree tweaks are needed, but how far those adjustments should go is where the debate continues today.
She championed SB 91 in the Senate, but now Mia Costello is leading the charge in the Capitol to repeal it.
Is it hard to say I was on the wrong side?
Well, it is hard to say, but I think that the truth is needed here.
The Republican senator from Anchorage surveyed Alaskans about crime and found the response overwhelming.
A good friend's car was stolen and the thieves drove around doing drugs.
She has 2 binders full of stories like that one and believes the only way to regain Alaskans' trust is to undo SB 91 completely with her measure, Senate Bill 127.
It was a massive undertaking, and I was a co-sponsor of the legislation, as were many of my colleagues, and we got it wrong.
In the House majority, Representative Andy Josephson doesn't see a way forward for a full repeal.
It's a little bit like a tanker leaving port. You can't turn it on a dime. I wish it had not happened. I was the only member of my party to vote against SB 91 in 2016. I fought it with every, ounce of my being, but it did. And I don't know that we can just pretend it never happened.
House Minority Leader Sharice Millett supports a full repeal of SB 91, but she's also sponsoring House Bill 335, a measure to make changes to the risk assessment tool.
That mandatory release is off the table, and it's a tool, and it's not the rule. Even if someone scored low on that, the judge still has the discretion.
You don't want there to ever be a situation where a judge thinks someone is dangerous but can't keep them away from the public.
Yes, and I believe that is happening now.
The least invasive proposal for changing pretrial comes from Governor Bill Walker's desk and seems to be getting the most traction. The initial version of SB 150 would allow judges to override the tool when it calls for mandatory release, but only in cases in which the defendant has out-of-state criminal history.
SB 150 is written. It's really written to be very narrow and very targeted.
That bill got its first hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee on March 21st after this March 9th email to the Judiciary chairs from Attorney General Donna Lindemuth. The email cites the KTVA story in which 2 alleged repeat car thieves qualified for mandatory release and urges them to hold hearings on the governor's bill, saying it may be a permanent fix to this awful situation.
The pretrial process has never been without its issues. What we have tried to address tonight is whether the state has invested wisely in a computerized test that, for now, appears to be an unreliable predictor of behavior, and in some cases removes judges from the process altogether. What we can say for certain is that the flaws of this new pretrial tool are now apparent, with new pretrial officers watching defendants who were previously unsupervised. Progress has been made, but the question remains, how much? I'm Daniela Rivera. We will keep watching this developing story, and we thank you for watching tonight.